We never touched a white man before. The three Apache sisters told the young farmer. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a bright afternoon on a farm that seemed far from the world's eyes. Nestled in the outskirts of the desert, the young farmer, Thomas, had built a simple life for himself. The land stretched out around him, parched and dry, but it was his own piece of the world, and he had learned to live with its solitude. A solitary man by nature, Thomas kept to himself, with little need for the company of others. He worked the land, raised livestock, and took pride in the quiet of his life. But today, everything was about to change. As Thomas finished repairing a fence near the edge of his property, he heard the faint sound of hooves in the distance. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was just another wandering traveler passing by, but something felt different. The sound grew closer, and before long, three figures appeared on horseback, moving swiftly across the horizon. They were women, Apache women, their faces painted with tribal markings. Thomas had seen enough travelers and outsiders to recognize them for what they were, but what struck him most was their demeanor. They weren't just passing through. They seemed purposeful, their movements steady and deliberate, as if they had a mission. The lead woman, tall and graceful, was the first to approach him. She dismounted with a fluid motion, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that immediately caught him off guard. The other two women, slightly behind her, watched him with a curious mix of caution and interest. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. He had heard stories of the Apache, of their fierce reputation and the untamed spirit they carried, but he had never met them face to face. And now, here they were, on his land, approaching him without fear. The woman spoke first, her voice steady, but with a trace of something unexpected, vulnerability, perhaps. We never touched a white man before, she said. Thomas blinked, unsure how to respond. There was a strange tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and unease. The woman's words seemed to carry a weight that Thomas couldn't quite place. As she stood before him, a sense of history and destiny seemed to swirl around them. It was clear that something significant was unfolding, something neither of them fully understood. The other two women dismounted, standing behind the leader in silence, their eyes never leaving Thomas. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling the dry grass. Then, the woman spoke again, her words breaking the stillness. We are the sisters of the Apache tribe. We have come to you for a reason, one that we cannot explain fully just yet. Her eyes softened for a brief moment, before hardening again. Thomas's heart raced as he stood there, the weight of the situation settling on him. What had he gotten himself into? He had no idea. And yet, deep down, he knew that this moment would change his life forever. Thomas stood there, staring at the three Apache sisters, his heart racing. Their words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and despite the heat of the sun, a cold chill ran down his spine. The woman who had spoken, the leader of the trio, had a presence that was impossible to ignore. She was tall, her posture straight and proud, and her eyes bore a depth of wisdom and history that Thomas had never encountered before. He wasn't sure what to say or how to react. He had heard stories of the Apache, tales of their fierce warrior spirit and their independence, but he had never imagined he would find himself standing before them, on his own land, with them looking to him for something he couldn't yet understand. The silence between them stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. The two other sisters stood a little behind the leader, their faces equally unreadable. Thomas noticed that the younger sister, the one with the braided hair, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The older sister, her hair streaked with silver, had a quiet intensity about her, like she was ready for anything. The leader spoke again, her voice soft but firm. We have come because we need your help, she said. Thomas blinked, processing her words slowly. Help? I don't even know who you are or what you need. The leader nodded, acknowledging his confusion. I am Tala, and these are my sisters Lila and Simi. We come from the Apache tribe, far from here. We have traveled many days to find you. We know you are a good man. Thomas's brow furrowed. Good man, he echoed. He had always thought of himself as someone who simply worked the land and kept to himself. He wasn't used to being called a good man. The leader's gaze softened as she watched him. Yes, a good man. We believe you have a strength inside of you, a strength that can help us when the time comes. Thomas shook his head. I'm just a farmer. I don't know what kind of strength you're talking about. Lila, the younger sister, stepped forward, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. You don't know yet, she said softly. But you will. The older sister, Simi, remained silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though she was waiting for something to appear. The atmosphere around them seemed to thicken as the weight of their words sank in. We've come to ask you for something that may seem impossible, Tala continued, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Our people are in danger. There are those who wish to take our land, to destroy what we've built over generations. Thomas felt a pang of sympathy. He had heard of the struggles between settlers and the native tribes, the clashes over land and resources that had torn the country apart. But he had never imagined being caught in the middle of it. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tala looked at him intently, her eyes never leaving his. We need your help to protect our people, to stand with us when the time comes. Thomas hesitated. He had lived his life in isolation, far from the battles of the outside world. He had always believed that he had no place in such matters, that his life was too small to matter in the grand scheme of things. But now, standing in front of these women, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of duty, of purpose. I don't know what I can do, he admitted. Tala smiled slightly, as though she had expected his response. You may not know now, but soon you will. You will see what you are capable of. The words felt like a promise, and as much as Thomas wanted to resist, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point in his life. The three sisters turned to leave, but before they did, Tala spoke again, her voice low. We will return when the time is right. Until then, stay prepared, Thomas. The future is coming for all of us. As the sisters rode off into the distance, Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the empty horizon. The world around him felt different now, charged with something he couldn't explain. He had no idea what the future held, but deep down, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The days after the Apache sisters left Thomas's farm were filled with uncertainty and quiet tension. He couldn't stop thinking about their words, about the promise they had made. The weight of their request, their belief in him, lingered like a shadow. He had never considered himself more than a simple farmer, a man who lived alone, away from the world. But now, with the memory of the three women's eyes, Thomas felt a stirring within himself, something he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. He had been alone for so long, but now he felt the need for something greater, something more. The sun was setting one evening when he heard it, the familiar sound of hooves. It was only a moment before he recognized the figures riding towards him, three women again, as if summoned by some unseen force. His heart skipped a beat as the sisters approached, riding with the same quiet authority as before. Tala led them, her gaze steady and unyielding. The two younger sisters, Lila and Simi, followed closely behind, their faces serious. As they dismounted, Tala met Thomas's eyes, and he could see something new in her expression. The time has come, she said simply. Her voice carried a weight of finality, and Thomas felt his heart race. What do you mean? What's happening? He asked, his voice tight with unease. Tala nodded. The settlers, the men who want our land, they are coming. And they are coming soon. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had heard rumors, whispers of conflict between settlers and the native tribes, but he had never imagined that he would be thrust into the middle of it. He had never considered himself part of this battle, but now it seemed that fate had other plans. We need your help, Thomas, Tala continued. We cannot stand against them alone. Thomas stood there, unsure of what to say. He had no experience in battle, no knowledge of how to defend land or people. He was just a farmer. I don't know if I can help you, he said quietly. Lila stepped forward, her eyes filled with something fierce. You can, she said, her voice full of conviction. You don't need to be a warrior. You just need to stand with us, to fight for what's right. Thomas looked at the three women, their strength and determination radiating from them. He felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, courage. The world around him seemed to shift, and he knew, deep down, that he couldn't turn away. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady. Tala smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You'll know when the time comes. But for now, we need to prepare. We need to gather our people, and we need to make a stand." That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, Thomas sat alone in his cabin, his thoughts swirling. He had never imagined he would find himself in such a position. He had lived his life in the quiet of the land, far from conflict, but now he was being asked to fight for something much bigger than himself. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt a sense of purpose, a sense that he was part of something much larger than the small world he had known. The next few days were a blur of activity. The Apache sisters stayed with him, preparing for the coming battle. They taught him what little they could about the ways of their people, about survival and strength. As the days passed, Thomas began to feel a deep connection to the sisters, to their way of life, and to their cause. They weren't just asking him to help. They were asking him to be part of their world, to stand beside them as equals. And in return, Thomas found himself gaining a sense of belonging, something he had never known. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, the sound of hooves reached Thomas's ears. It was the sound of many horses coming fast. His heart raced. The time had come. The settlers were approaching, and this would be the moment that would change everything. Thomas stood tall, his chest filled with a mix of fear and determination. The Apache sisters were with him, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. The battle ahead would be fierce, but Thomas knew that whatever happened, he was no longer just a farmer. He was part of something much bigger. He was part of a fight for survival, for justice, and for the future. The air was thick with tension as Thomas stood at the edge of his property, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Apache sisters had been gone for several days, gathering the tribes and preparing for the inevitable clash. The days had turned into a blur of work, planning, and quiet moments of doubt. But now, as the morning sun began to climb over the distant hills, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. He had a purpose now, something greater than himself. And as the first signs of movement appeared on the horizon, he knew the time had come. The Apache women had warned him this day would come, but nothing had prepared him for the sight before him. A cloud of dust billowed in the distance, rising higher as the riders approached. Thomas's heart raced as he realized that the settlers were coming, not as a few scattered men, but as a force, organized, relentless. They were coming for the land, and they were coming to take it from the Apache people. With each passing moment, the riders grew closer. Thomas stood tall, his hands trembling slightly, but his feet rooted firmly to the ground. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was part of something much bigger, a fight for justice, for survival, for the future. The Apache sisters arrived just as the riders were about to crest the hill. Tala, Lila, and Simi rode in with the same fierce determination they had shown when they first arrived at his farm. Behind them, a small but powerful group of Apache warriors followed, their faces painted with the symbols of their people. They were ready for battle. Tala rode up to Thomas, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that spoke volumes. "Stay close to us," she said, her voice low but steady. "This is our fight, but you are one of us now. We will protect you." Thomas nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an outsider. He was part of something much bigger. The battle began quickly. The settlers, armed with rifles and mounted on horses, charged forward, but the Apache warriors met them with a fierce resolve. The air was filled with the sounds of hooves pounding the earth, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the battle cries of the Apache warriors. Thomas, unsure of what to do at first, stood frozen for a moment. But then, remembering the strength and courage of the Apache sisters, he grabbed his rifle and moved forward, joining the fight. It wasn't long before the settlers realized they were up against more than they had bargained for. The Apache warriors fought with a wild, unrelenting fury, using the land to their advantage. The settlers, unaccustomed to such fierce resistance, were thrown into disarray. But the fight wasn't just about guns and strength. It was about survival, about protecting their homes and their people. Thomas found himself in the thick of it, his heart pounding as he fired his rifle, his aim guided by the lessons he had learned from the Apache sisters. The battle raged on for what seemed like hours, but slowly, the tide began to turn in favor of the Apache. The settlers were pushed back, their numbers dwindling as they retreated toward the hills. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the battlefield, it was clear that the Apache had won. The land was theirs, for now. Thomas stood amidst the aftermath, his body sore and covered in dust. He looked around at the Apache warriors, their faces grim but victorious. Tala rode up to him, her eyes softening as she took in his weary form. "You did well today, Thomas," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You fought like one of us." Thomas, though exhausted, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had fought for something bigger than himself. He had fought for justice, for survival, for the future. And in that moment, he knew that this was just the beginning. The war for the land was far from over, but they had won this battle. And that, for now, was enough. The aftermath of the battle left the land eerily quiet. The dust settled slowly, clinging to the air like a thick fog, and Thomas stood in the center of it, feeling a strange mixture of pride and exhaustion. The Apache warriors, though battered, had held their ground. They had fought not just for the land, but for their way of life, for the very spirit of their people. Tala, Lila, and Simi rode slowly through the battlefield, their eyes scanning the area as they surveyed the damage. The fight was over, but the war was far from finished. The settlers had retreated for now, but it was clear they would return, driven by greed and the relentless push for more land. Thomas knew this was just the beginning. He had learned more in the past few days than he had in his entire life. The Apache women had shown him a strength he never knew he had, and he had stood beside them as an equal, fighting not just for survival, but for a cause. As he walked toward Tala, who had dismounted from her horse, he could see the weariness in her eyes. She had led the charge, had fought as fiercely as any of her warriors. "We've won this battle, but the fight isn't over," she said, her voice steady, though there was a deep sadness in it. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "What happens now?" he asked. Tala looked at him for a long moment before replying. "We prepare. We gather more warriors. We need to be ready for the next wave." She paused, glancing at the horizon, where the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of red and orange. "The settlers will not give up. They will keep coming." Thomas felt the gravity of her words settle on him. He had seen firsthand the lengths people would go to for land and power. But he had also seen the strength of the Apache people, the fire in their hearts that refused to be extinguished. "I'll stay," he said quietly, his voice firm. Tala raised an eyebrow. "Stay?" she asked. "This land is your home now. You could leave, return to your farm, and forget all of this. No one would blame you." Thomas shook his head. "No, I've made my choice. I'm here, with you. I'll help you fight." There was a moment of silence between them, and then Tala nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Then you are one of us now," she said softly. The bond between them, between him and the Apache people, had deepened in that moment. They were no longer just allies, they were family. As the days passed, Thomas worked alongside the Apache warriors, learning their ways. He trained with them, picking up skills he never thought he would need. He learned how to fight, how to survive in the harsh desert, and how to honor the land they fought for. The sisters were patient with him, teaching him everything they knew. But it wasn't just the physical training that changed him. It was the lessons they imparted about honor, loyalty, and strength. They were lessons that went beyond fighting. They were about the spirit of survival, about standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. The war was far from over, and Thomas knew that. But now, as he stood with Tala and the Apache warriors, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known. This was his fight, too. The land he had once tended to alone was now something he was willing to protect with everything he had. And he wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for the people who had taught him what it meant to truly live, to truly stand for something. The days were filled with preparations, with training, and with quiet moments of reflection. Thomas found himself thinking of his past life, of the days when he had lived alone, when he had felt so disconnected from the world. But now, standing alongside the Apache people, he felt a sense of belonging he had never felt before. He was no longer just a man on a farm. He was part of something much bigger. He was part of a people, a cause, and a fight that would determine the future of the land and those who called it home. And as the days passed and the settlers' threat loomed closer, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He would not stand by and watch. He would fight for this land. He would fight for the Apache people. And together, they would stand against the forces that threatened to tear them apart. As the weeks passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. Thomas and the Apache sisters continued to prepare for the inevitable return of the settlers. The small victories they had celebrated were now distant memories, and the reality of the situation began to settle in. The settlers were not just a group of men. They were a force driven by power, greed, and the idea that they could take whatever they wanted. And yet, Thomas knew, deep down, that they could not take the spirit of the Apache people. He had learned that lesson well. The Apache were not just defending land. They were defending a way of life, a history, and a future that could not be erased. The day came when the first sign of the settlers' return appeared. A small scouting party emerged on the horizon, riding in a tight formation, their presence undeniable. It was a reminder that the fight was far from over. The Apache warriors, led by Tala, prepared to meet the settlers head-on. Thomas, now trained and ready, stood alongside them, his rifle steady in his hands. It was strange to him, this sense of camaraderie. He had once been alone, disconnected from the world around him. But now, he felt a deep connection to these people, to their struggle. He had become part of something much larger than himself. Tala turned to him before the battle began. "You are ready, Thomas," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes told a different story, one of years of struggle, of fights fought and lost, of victories earned through blood and sweat. "Just remember what you are fighting for." Thomas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I won't forget," he replied. As the Apache warriors prepared for the skirmish, Thomas found himself in the thick of it once again. The riders approached, and the battle began almost immediately. The sound of hooves pounding the earth, the crack of rifles, the war cries of the Apache warriors filled the air. Thomas fought with everything he had learned, moving with precision, his body reacting without thought as he fired his rifle and took cover when needed. His muscles ached, and his heart raced, but he kept going. For the Apache, for the land, for the future. The fight was fierce, but the Apache warriors had the advantage. They knew the land better than anyone, using it to their advantage in ways the settlers could not match. The settlers' tactics were predictable, their movements clumsy compared to the Apache's fluid grace. But still, the settlers pressed forward, determined to take what they had come for. As the battle raged on, Thomas found himself in a confrontation with one of the settlers, a tall, burly man who seemed intent on taking him down. The man raised his rifle, aiming directly at Thomas, and in that moment, time seemed to slow. Thomas's heart pounded, and his hand trembled, but he didn't hesitate. He fired first, hitting the man in the chest, and the settler fell to the ground. The rush of adrenaline was overwhelming, but there was no time to process it. The battle wasn't over yet. When the dust finally began to settle, Thomas stood amidst the remnants of the battle, his body aching from the fight. The Apache warriors had won, but the cost was heavy. Several warriors had fallen, their lives sacrificed for the cause. As Thomas looked around, he saw the faces of the Apache sisters, their expressions somber but resolute. Tala approached him, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes were steady. "You did well, Thomas," she said, her voice soft. "You fought with honor." Thomas felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, but there was no time to bask in the victory. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Tala paused for a moment, looking out over the battlefield. "Now we regroup. We heal. We prepare for what comes next." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The settlers had been driven back, but they would be back, and the Apache people would be ready. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the land, Thomas stood with the Apache sisters and the warriors. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. He had fought not for survival, but for something much bigger. He had fought for the future, for the land, and for the people who had shown him what it truly meant to live with honor and courage. The fight wasn't over yet, but Thomas knew that as long as he stood with the Apache people, they would face whatever came next together. The days after the battle passed slowly, filled with a somber sense of victory that hung in the air like the dust that never quite settled. Thomas stood at the edge of his property, looking out across the land, feeling the weight of the war that had only just begun. The settlers had been pushed back for now, but Tala had been clear. This was far from over. They had only won a single battle, and there would be more. There had to be. In the days that followed, Thomas continued to stand with the Apache warriors, working alongside them, learning their ways, and solidifying his place in the tribe. Each day, he became more than just a farmer. He was part of something larger, something much more important. As the Apache women had taught him, strength was not just in the body, but in the heart, and Thomas felt his heart grow stronger with every lesson. Tala, always the leader, kept the warriors focused. She organized them with precision, making sure that they were prepared for the future battles that were sure to come. Lila was always by her side, her calm and steady presence a reminder that even in the face of chaos, there was always room for peace. Simi, the youngest sister, still had that spark of youthful energy, but even she had learned the harsh realities of survival. They all knew that the settlers wouldn't rest until they had taken everything, until they had claimed the land as their own. But the Apache weren't ready to give up. The tribe had lived on this land for generations, and they would fight for it until their last breath. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Tala called for a meeting. The warriors gathered around the campfire, the crackling of the flames filling the silence as everyone waited for her to speak. Tala looked at each of them, her eyes intense and focused. "The settlers are not finished with us," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "We will face them again, and we will stand our ground. This land is our home. We will not lose it." The warriors nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Thomas stood among them, his heart beating faster. This was it. This was his fight. Now, he had seen what the Apache were willing to do to protect their people, their way of life, and he had made the choice to stand with them. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was part of this tribe, part of this fight. The next few weeks were filled with preparations. The Apache warriors trained harder, honing their skills, preparing for whatever the settlers might throw at them. Thomas worked tirelessly alongside them, learning to fight with his rifle, his knife, and his bare hands. The bond between him and the sisters grew stronger, their connection not just one of necessity, but of respect. They had taught him to fight, but more than that, they had taught him how to survive, how to honor the land, and how to fight for something greater than himself. As the days passed, the Apache tribe gathered more warriors, sending scouts to keep an eye on the settlers' movements. The tension in the air grew thick, and everyone knew that the next battle would come soon. But it wasn't just about the fight. It was about what was at stake. The Apache weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for their future, for the survival of their people. And Thomas was right there beside them. The morning the settlers returned, it was as if the air itself had charged with electricity. The ground beneath Thomas's feet seemed to vibrate with the anticipation of the battle ahead. The Apache were ready. They had trained, prepared, and made their stand. They wouldn't back down. As the first wave of settlers appeared on the horizon, Thomas's heart raced, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. He had already made his choice. He would fight. The battle was fierce, harder than any Thomas had imagined. The settlers were well armed, but the Apache warriors were swift, using the terrain to their advantage. The battle raged, the sounds of gunfire and war cries filling the air as Thomas fought side by side with the Apache. His rifle never faltered, and his hands never wavered. He was no longer the man who had once lived in solitude. He was part of this, part of the Apache tribe, and he would fight with them until the end. As the sun began to set and the battle began to wind down, Thomas stood victorious but exhausted. The settlers had been driven back once again, but the toll was heavy. There were losses on both sides. The land was stained with blood, and Thomas's heart ached for the warriors who had fallen. But there was no time for mourning, not yet. Tala approached him, her face somber but proud. "You fought well, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but filled with respect. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "We won, but the fight isn't over." Tala nodded, her gaze hardening. "No, it's not. But today, we've shown them that we will not be taken without a fight. We will stand." As the warriors gathered around, their faces filled with both pride and sorrow, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a bystander. He was part of the Apache tribe, and he would stand with them until the end. The night after the second battle was quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Fires burned low across the Apache camp, casting long shadows on the ground, and the wind carried the smell of dust and smoke through the valley. Thomas sat alone near the edge of the camp, staring into the darkness where the land stretched out toward his old farm. For the first time since this began, his thoughts turned inward instead of outward. He had fought beside the Apache. He had bled beside them. He had watched men fall on both sides. And now, standing between two worlds, he felt the weight of a choice pressing down on him. Tala approached silently, her footsteps barely disturbing the sand. She sat beside him without speaking at first, following his gaze toward the distant hills. "You are thinking about leaving?" she said at last. It was not an accusation. It was an understanding. Thomas nodded slowly. "I am thinking about what happens next. The settlers will keep coming. They always do. If I stay, I bring more danger to your people. I am a white farmer. They will never stop seeing me as one of their own." Tala looked at him then, really looked at him, as if measuring something deeper than words. "And if you leave," she asked, "who are you then?" "Just a farmer again. A man who pretends none of this changed him." Thomas did not answer. He did not know if he could go back to the life he once lived. The quiet mornings, the empty evenings, the fence lines, and the silence. That man felt like someone he had buried. Lila joined them, lowering herself to the ground on the other side of Thomas. Her voice was softer, but it carried weight. "Our people talk about you," she said. "Some are afraid. Some are grateful. All of them see that you stood when you could have run. That matters." Simi remained standing a short distance away, watching the camp, ever alert. Thomas took a slow breath. "I do not want to be the reason your children grow up in fear," he said. "I do not want them hunted because of me." Tala placed her hand on the ground between them. "Fear does not come from one man," she said. "It comes from those who believe they are owed everything. You did not bring this war. You only chose not to look away from it." Silence settled again, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Thomas felt something inside him break open, something he had held tight for most of his life. "I have never belonged anywhere," he said quietly. "Not with the settlers. Not truly on my own land. Out here, I finally understood what it means to stand for something. But I do not know if I have the right to stay." Tala turned fully toward him now. "Belonging is not taken," she said. "It is given, and it is earned. You have earned it in ways blood cannot measure." At dawn, the camp gathered. Warriors stood in a wide circle, their expressions unreadable. Elders stepped forward, their faces marked by years of hardship and survival. Thomas stood alone in the center, feeling every eye on him. Tala spoke for him, her voice carrying across the open ground. "This man came to us as a stranger. He fought as an ally. He stayed when others would have fled." The elders studied Thomas in silence. One of them stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "The land remembers who stands for it," he said. "People remember who protects more than themselves. You may walk away, or you may walk with us. But know this. If you stay, you are no longer between worlds. You choose one." Thomas felt the weight of that truth settle deep in his chest. He looked at the faces around him, at the warriors, at the children watching from behind their mothers, at Tala, Lila, and Simi, who had changed his life without ever meaning to. "I choose to stay," he said, "not as a savior, not as an owner, but as a man who will stand when standing matters." The elders nodded. No cheers followed. No celebration. Just quiet acceptance. As the sun rose over the land, Thomas felt something he had never known before. Not victory, not certainty, but purpose. And in that quiet morning light, the boundary between who he had been and who he had become finally disappeared. The days turned into weeks, and as the war continued, the land itself began to bear the marks of the battle. The settlers had not given up, but neither had the Apache. The conflict raged on, but there was something different now. Thomas was no longer just a man caught between two worlds. He had become part of the Apache tribe, part of their fight for survival. It was no longer a choice between the life he had left behind and the life that was being forced upon him. He had forged a new path, one of strength, purpose, and belonging. But even in the midst of the struggle, there were moments of peace. Thomas had grown to appreciate the quiet beauty of the land, the way the wind moved through the tall grass, the warmth of the sun on his face, and the simple acts of kindness shared between the warriors and the sisters. He had found a family in the Apache people, and in turn, they had found a man who would fight beside them, no matter the cost. One evening, as the camp gathered around the fire, Tala turned to Thomas with a quiet smile. The war was not over, but there had been victories, small ones, but victories nonetheless. The Apache had held their ground, and for a moment, it seemed as if the tide was turning in their favor. But Tala knew the battle for their future was far from finished. "This fight will go on," she said softly, her eyes meeting Thomas's. "But whatever happens, know that you are part of this. You've proven yourself to be one of us, and that is something no one can take from you." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had come to this land a stranger, but now, after everything they had been through, he felt as if he had always belonged here. The next day, the warriors gathered once again. The settlers were approaching in full force, their numbers larger than before. It was the final confrontation, the one that would decide the fate of the land. The Apache had been preparing for this moment for years. The warriors were ready, and the sisters were resolute. They knew this battle would be their greatest test, but they also knew that they would fight until the end. As the settlers advanced, the Apache stood their ground. The air was thick with the sound of hooves and the crackle of gunfire. Thomas fought beside Tala, Lila, and Simi, feeling the rhythm of the battle take over him. The world narrowed to the sound of his heartbeat, the feel of his rifle in his hands, and the faces of the Apache warriors around him. They were not fighting for land alone. They were fighting for their culture, their legacy, and their future. The battle was long and brutal. The settlers were relentless, but the Apache were driven by something deeper. They fought with a ferocity that could not be matched. And in the end, it was the Apache who emerged victorious. The settlers were forced to retreat, their dreams of taking the land shattered. The Apache had won, but it had come at a great cost. Many lives were lost, and the land was scarred. But as Thomas stood in the aftermath, he felt a quiet pride. They had fought for something worth fighting for, and they had succeeded. The land was theirs, and for the first time, it felt like home. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with hues of red and gold, Thomas stood with the Apache warriors, looking out over the land. This was his land now, not just by ownership, but by choice. He had fought for it, and he had earned it. Tala stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor. "You've done more than any of us expected," she said, her voice soft but full of pride. "You've proven yourself not just as a warrior, but as a leader." Thomas looked at her, his heart full. "I'm not a leader," he said quietly, "but I will stand with you, always." And in that moment, as the land stretched out before them, Thomas knew that he had finally found his place. He was not just a farmer, not just a man caught between two worlds. He was part of the Apache people, part of the land, and part of a legacy that would endure long after the battles were fought and the dust had settled. The war was over, for now, but the future was still unwritten, and Thomas was ready to face it, with the Apache by his side, as they built a future together. A future where they would no longer be pushed from their land, where they could live in peace, and where they could stand together as one.